There are two basic types of statistical studies. There's observational studies, and then there are experimental studies. And in observational studies, we have two different types. We have a case-controlled study and we have a non-case controlled study. And we really don't have to get into all the terminology. It's more about understanding the difference between an observational study and an experimental study. An observational study is when we are simply observing the participants. And in an experimental study, we are introducing a treatment of some sort. Most often observational studies, a lot of that is done in education and science, in maybe in nature, or a lot of education, or a lot of observational studies, where most generally experiments are in sciences and in medicine, are generally where you see these types of two different types of studies. Not to say that one can't be crossover to the other. It's just generally those are where they come from. So let's talk about experimental first because that will help us with the case controlled. So in an experimental study, researchers divide the sample into a control and a treatment group, then administer the experiment. They introduce that treatment to the treatment group. And it's very important that we do what we call blinding. And blinding is so that both the researcher so definitely so the researcher doesn't know who is in the group, but also the participants don't know who's in the group. So there's what we call single blinded, where the researchers do know who's in which group. Double blinded is only the administrator knows who is in which group, the researchers do not. And in most cases, it's best to do a double blind study because researchers can can introduce their own ideas into if they know which group is which. We also, in experimentals, we have the placebo and a placebo effect that can occur. And a placebo is when we have the treatment is actually not being administered. It's a substitute that looks like the treatment, of whatever kind it is, that's actually introduced. And the placebo effect is when a person thinks that they are, say, recovering, even though that they are not actually being given whatever treatment or drug is supposed to be being tested, if you will. One idea about one example of an experimental, or another example of an experimental study is a study is looking at tomato plants treated with a new fertilizer. So they have introduced a fertilizer. Now, tomato plants really don't have emotion, so you probably could do this as a single blind, so the researchers know which plants are getting which fertilization. But if it was anything other than plants, it's most generally good to have a double blind study so nobody really knows who's in which groups. And so in observational, remember, we're just observing. And so what we have this thing called a case control situation. So it looks like an experiment, but because of moral or ethical reasons, you can't actually have people in a treatment group. So it just demonstrates that the groups naturally divide themselves into two. It's supposed to be two, TWO, two or more groups. So an example of this is, let's say a breast cancer study was done, and the 25,624 women were questioned. So that's our sample. And they wanted to find out about the health of these women, and it was tracked over 15 years. So this is what we would call a longitudinal observational study. And they're looking at women who exercise regularly versus those that don't, and whether or not they incur breast cancer. So the fact that they are exercising regularly is a natural group that's going to be different than a group that does not exercise. So we can't ethically or morally tell a set of women to not exercise versus exercise because we want to find out if they have breast cancer. But we can observe those women that do exercise regularly versus the women that don't exercise regularly to find out what their incidence of breast cancer is. Okay, so that's a case control. So it's similar to an experiment because you have two groups, two or more groups, but it's actually not something that is forced upon. It is just done naturally. And in a non-case control, we don't have grouping that happens. So we just have these first year college students. We're finding out if they had an A average in high school. So this again is just an observation. We're just pulling some transcript records, finding out what their grade in high school was. So that's what we would consider an observational study. And then we also want to talk a little bit about bias. And first off, we want to say that, want to make sure we mention that all studies have bias. There is no bias-free study. And bias is fine because it's always going to happen because we always have people either performing the study, we have humans interacting with the experiment, whatever it has to be. And so bias will always exist. But the most important thing is that we write about a bias. Okay, so we write about the bias and eliminate as much bias as possible. And then we have a sound statistical study. Okay, so just recognize that all studies will have bias. We can never eliminate all bias. And again, there are two that are specifically talked about in the text, selection bias and participation bias. So selection bias is generally when an underrepresented group is left out, or specifically sampling a certain selection. So specifically selected sample. And then participation bias, a lot of times you'll see these just in random polling, especially like um, generally with social media when they will ask what your opinion about certain things is, depending on what's social media you might be on. So participation bias is simply those people that choose to. So if you choose to participate, is participation bias, where only those people that are choosing to participate would be in that particular sample.